Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. 47 U.S. Republican senators wrote an open letter to Iran warning the country about any nuclear agreement with the U.S. While President Obama's request for military action against the Islamic State is facing opposition by a divided Congress. Here to explore it all is a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Congressman Ron DeSantis, who joins us from Jacksonville, Florida. Congressman, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Now, the administration is requesting authorization from Congress to fight a military operation against ISIS. Why not grant it to them?
Well, it's interesting. When the president announced strikes against ISIS last September, he said, I think correctly, that he had the authority to act based on both the 2001 AUMF that was signed after 9/11 and the 2002 AUMF for Iraq. And so what he's proposed now to a lot of Republican members, including myself, appears to be an LUMF, a limitation on the use of military force, because there are certain restrictions as to the time that we can be engaged against ISIS and the capacity to use ground forces. And I'm somebody that thinks even if you don't intend to use ground forces, I think it's a mistake to telegraph to the enemy, hey, here's what we won't do and here's how long we'll stay. And so I think there's opposition from a lot of the Republicans in Congress because we view it as a limitation. And then I think some of the Democrats, they view it as, well, this could allow the president to do more than we want. They want an extremely limited authorization. So I don't know if he was trying to thread the needle, but I don't think that this is necessarily something Congress is going to rally around right now.
Now, the administration says, look, we need to present a united front, and the reason the president is placing a 3-year limitation is so that the American people can decide as he leaves office the best option to pursue or whether to pursue ISIS at all. What's wrong with that reasoning?
Well, look, I think as a fundamental level, why would you want to limit the authority? Number two is, if he already has the existing authority based on the previous AUMFs, it doesn't really make sense why you would take over that with this new authority or the new limitations on the authority. And so I'm just not sure that it makes less sense. And I think also there's this issue as you've watched this unfold with ISIS. As America has dropped bombs on ISIS for sure, most of the fighting on the ground being done that's effective against ISIS is being done by Iranian-backed Shiite militias.
Right.
You have the commander of the Quds Force, which is the special ops arm of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, Qasem Soleimani. He's directing these operations in Tikrit, which is Saddam Hussein's homeland, historically a very Sunni city. Soleimani and these Shiite militias, when guys like me were in Iraq during the 2006, 7, 8 period, they killed hundreds and hundreds of U.S. service members. They had very significant EFP devices, which are more powerful than a typical IED. So, and I think Prime Minister Netanyahu, when he was in front of the Congress last week, he made a good point. Yes, you need to defeat ISIS, but if your strategy to defeat ISIS elevates Iran, and Iran is the dominant power in the region, and Iran is controlling Iraq, well, you may have won the battle, but you may have lost the war, because at the end of the day, Iran has a very similar ideology to ISIS.
Let's talk for a moment about Iran. The United States is now in open conversation with the Iranian Republic. They are trying to make a deal about limiting their nuclear program over a 10-year period. Here's the question. Does reducing the sanctions, once you reduce the sanctions, lift the sanctions on Iran and give their economy a break, how do you police that whatever restrictions they're promising on their nuclear program? How do you enforce it?
Well, I don't think you do. And I think that the point is that if this is just an executive agreement, if the president's not going to submit it to Congress, it's not binding on the American government. A new president could change it, Congress can override it, and if it's not binding on the United States, why would Iran feel that they were bound by it? So I think they absolutely would be able to cheat and continue to pursue nuclear weapons. Part of the problem, though, with the agreement is if they actually kept the agreement for 10 years, they would still potentially get a nuclear weapon. And so in many ways, they could get a weapon by violating the agreement, and they could get a weapon by keeping the agreement at the end of that 10-year period. And so that is something that is very concerning to a lot of members of Congress. And I think Prime Minister Netanyahu made a very strong case that this is simply not sufficient to deny Iran a nuclear weapon.
Congressman, I want to play you something. This is Secretary of State John Kerry, who is leading the delegation on Sunday in Switzerland to craft some deal with the Iranians. Here was his reaction to the suggestion that you just shared with our audience, that Congress should have to approve any agreement. Listen.
It's incorrect when it says that Congress could actually modify the terms of an agreement at any time. That's flat wrong. They don't have the right to modify an agreement reached executive to executive between leaders of a country.
Your reaction to that?
Well, I don't think that that's accurate. I think if the Congress were to, for example, reimpose tough sanctions, the president could absolutely veto that. But the Congress can then turn around and override the president's veto. And so if the president strikes a deal with the Ayatollah in Iran and Congress passes legislation over the president's veto, the president would be bound by what the Congress passed. And so it's possible that Congress would not have 2/3 and the president could veto the legislation and then keep his agreement with the Ayatollah. But Congress absolutely has a role. And I think especially in this case, when you're talking about negotiating an agreement about nuclear weapons with the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism, a country that was responsible for funding the attack on our Marines in 1983 in Beirut. And as I mentioned earlier, that it was responsible for killing hundreds and hundreds of U.S. service members in Iraq. This is something that the American people absolutely deserve to weigh in on.
Let's talk for a moment about the letter that we heard Secretary Kerry reference, Tom Cotton's letter signed by 47 Republican senators. It was sent, an open letter, to the Iranian leadership. It apparently missed the fact that the foreign minister spoke English and was American trained, which he's being criticized for. Was that letter appropriate? Do you support its message and tone?
I think the letter was absolutely correct in pointing out to the Iranians that if they strike a deal with the United States that Congress does not approve, then it's not a deal that's ultimately going to need to be accepted by the Congress, and it's not going to be a deal that will need to be honored by future administrations. And so it was a basic statement of fact. I don't know what the hullabaloo about in Washington has been about. And even John Kerry in his testimony before the Foreign Relations Committee, he acknowledged that the agreement was not binding. And so I think it was a basic statement of fact. And, you know, I served with Tom Cotton in the House, and this is a guy who is very serious about protecting our national security, and he is very serious about denying Iran a nuclear weapon. And that wasn't something that he would do lightly.
Let's talk for a moment about Syria. You alluded to it earlier, this ongoing fight with ISIS. We're seeing these Christian populations rounded up, routinely and summarily killed. What option do we really have on the ground in Syria? I know we had a rebel force that it was reported a few weeks ago. The group that we were financing, the group that we were arming, has apparently given the field away, and some of them have joined the other fighters, Islamic fighters on the ground against the Syrian government. What is our option there? I know they're going to train 5,000 fighters, but how credible is this? Is this an appropriate foreign policy for the region?
Well, look, it's been an utter disaster in Syria. Part of the reason is this is about 3 years too late to have an opposition force to Assad. What you have now is basically a lot of Sunni Islamist fighters who are not that much further away from ISIS. Their main thing is to fight a sectarian conflict against Assad, and they absolutely are no friend of the Christians in that region. And so they've never really been a dependable ally. The idea that if we just arm these folks, then somehow that's going to advance America's security interests, I've always thought that that was problematic, and I think you're seeing that with the recent news where you have people armed by the United States turning over their weapons to the local al-Qaeda affiliate. And so what you have is a major humanitarian disaster, and it's something where we at this point do not have a good partner in Syria. What I would do is fight ISIS in Iraq with Kurdish forces, using Arab forces from other Gulf states. I think you do need more U.S. Special Operations forces. Once you succeed there, then I think you need to have some of these Arab troops that are going to be involved in the Syria campaign. But if you don't have that, then it's just going to be a bunch of bad guys fighting each other, and the losers are going to be innocent civilians and, as we've seen tragically, thousands of Christians.
Congressman, before I let you go, we only have a couple of minutes here. I know you spent some time at Guantanamo Bay, not behind bars. You were serving the country. Tell us for a moment your opinion of this ongoing rapprochement with the Cuban government, the Castro regime. There seem to be prisoner swaps underway, a lessening of the embargo or the hope of lifting it. That's what the president's hoping. Your take on this newfound openness between Cuba and the United States. Is this a good deal for the U.S. and the world?
No, the United States, we're getting nothing. These are purely unilateral concessions to the Castro regime. The Cuban people are not going to benefit from this. Any increased economic activity is going to benefit the military and the Castro dictatorship. And I think it's important for U.S. policy to stand on the side of the Cuban people who have been oppressed by the Castro regime for decades. And we've had a policy to try to hold the regime accountable, and people say, oh, well, it hasn't worked in the past, so let's just try something new. The problem with that argument is you got to look in the here and now, and who do these changes benefit? And I think the obvious answer is that they benefit the Castro regime. You have Venezuela and Russia, their two main patrons, are having a lot of economic problems due to world oil markets. They need an economic lifeline, and here is President Obama giving that to them. I think it's a huge mistake, and I think it makes it more difficult to bring freedom and democracy to the Cuban people.
Congressman Ron DeSantis, thanks for being here. We'll check in with you again soon.